Welcome to Ancient Sleep Stories. I'm truly honored to have you here tonight. Tell me, what part of the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Leave a comment below. I read every one, and it means so much. Now get comfortable. Take a deep breath and let the story begin. Tonight, we step into the muddy fields and smoky cottages of Tudor England, not as lords or ladies, but as humble pig farmers. Smell the earthy aroma of damp straw, hear the gentle grunts in the pen, and feel the cool morning dew as we rise to tend our swine in the reign of Henry VIII. The sky is still dark as we stir from our slumber, the faint glow of embers in the hearth our only light. The rough-hewn floorboards creak beneath our feet as we dress in simple woolen garments, readying ourselves for the day ahead. Outside, a gentle mist clings to the ground, obscuring the distant tree line and lending an air of mystery to the familiar landscape. As we step out of our modest cottage, the cool air nips at our cheeks, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and livestock. The first order of business is to tend to our porcine charges, and we make our way to the nearby pens, our footsteps squelching in the mud. The pigs greet us with a chorus of snorts and squeals, their eager faces pressed against the wooden fences. We reach for our well-worn slop buckets, filled to the brim with a pungent mixture of kitchen scraps and ale dregs collected from the local taverns and monasteries. The swill sloshes as we pour it into the hand-carved feeding troughs, and the pigs waste no time in devouring their breakfast with enthusiastic grunts. As the sun begins to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, we set about our daily routine. Some of our pigs are released to roam freely through the fields and even the village streets, a common sight in Tudor England. We watch as they root through the earth with their strong snouts, unearthing tasty morsels and helping to till the soil in their own way. Our eyes are ever watchful, for the art of pig watching is a vital skill in our trade. We scan for any signs of illness or aggression among our herd, knowing that early detection can mean the difference between a thriving farm and a devastating loss. Each pig has its own personality, and we've come to know them as well as we know our own kin. As the morning wears on, we tend to the various tasks that keep our farm running smoothly. We mend fences damaged by enthusiastic pigs, clean out the pens, and prepare fresh bedding of straw. The work is hard and often dirty, but there's a satisfaction in the simplicity of it all, in the connection to the land and the animals under our care. Midday brings a brief respite, and we retreat to our cottage for a simple meal of bread and cheese. The fire in the hearth crackles softly, filling the small space with warmth and the comforting scent of wood smoke. Through the small window, we can see our pigs contentedly rooting in the nearby field, their pink bodies stark against the green grass. As we rest, we can't help but reflect on our place in the grand tapestry of Tudor society. We may not be nobles or scholars, but our role is essential. The pigs we raise provide meat for the kitchens of great manors and humble homes alike. The offal and other parts not used for food are vital for local remedies and trade, ensuring that nothing goes to waste. Our thoughts are interrupted by a knock at the door. It's a messenger from the nearby manor, come to inquire about purchasing several of our pigs for an upcoming feast. We negotiate the price, our knowledge of our animals' worth giving us confidence despite our lowly status. This transaction reminds us that while we may be humble pig farmers, we are an integral part of the community. As afternoon fades into evening, we begin the process of gathering our roaming pigs back to their pens. We call out with practiced ease, our voices carrying across the fields. The pigs, familiar with the routine, begin to make their way back, their snouts and bellies caked with mud from a day of foraging. With the last of the pigs secured for the night, we take a moment to survey our domain in the fading light. A mist is returning, softening the edges of the world around us. In the distance, we can hear the faint sounds of the village settling down for the night. The clang of a blacksmith hammer, the laughter from the alehouse, the call of a mother to her children. We return to our cottage, weary but satisfied with the day's work. The fire is stoked once more, casting flickering shadows on the walls as we prepare for the evening meal. The scent of pottage simmering in the iron pot mingles with the ever-present aroma of smoke and earth that clings to our clothes and hair. As we sit down to eat, we give thanks for the bounty before us, humble though it may be. Our conversation turns to the plans for tomorrow, which pigs might be ready for market, whether the sow in the far pen might be expecting piglets, how we might improve our fences to keep the more adventurous pigs from straying too far. With full bellies and tired bodies, we prepare for sleep. The straw-filled mattress may be rough, but to us, it's the height of comfort after a long day's labor. As we drift off, the gentle grunts and snuffles from the nearby pig pens serve as a soothing lullaby, a reminder of the simple life we lead and the creatures that depend on us. In the quiet of the night, as the stars twinkle overhead and the moon casts its silver light over the sleeping farm, we rest easy. For tomorrow will bring another day of mud and muck, of squeals and snorts, of the earthy, honest work of a Tudor pig farmer. And in this moment, there's nowhere else we'd rather be. And so, dear listener, as our tale of Tudor pig farming comes to a close, I hope you found a moment of peace in this journey to the past. May the gentle oinks and the earthy scents of our humble farm lull you into a restful sleep. Remember, if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more adventures through history's quiet corners. And don't forget to share where you're listening from in the comments below. As we brush mud from our tunic sleeves and feed the sows once more, let's step further into the Tudor world, where superstition, slaughter, and seasonal fairs shape the fate of every pig and every farmer. Swill, sorcery, and seasonal rhythms of life governed the fate of pigs in Tudor England. And there's so much more to uncover about what it was like to be a Tudor pig farmer. The medieval period in Europe is often characterized as a time of famine and hardship. But actually, that's not quite accurate. There were plenty of banquets and feasts with plenty to go around. Just ask any surviving portrait of a wealthy Tudor monarch. However, that was not always the case when it came to pork. The availability of pork would have been subject to cycles of feast and famine, depending on the whims of the seasons. In the spring, farmers would see the birthing of new piglets, and they'd welcome these little porkers with open arms, because come autumn, many of them would be the stars of the show at the annual butchering moon. During this month, which typically fell in October, farmers across the land would fatten their swine in preparation for slaughter over the winter months. Farmers would gorge their pigs on swill and grains like barley, oats, wheat, and rye. This was not only done to fatten up the pigs for winter slaughter, but also because it made for more saleable meat. Fatter pigs meant fatter bacon, and since every part of the pig could be used, even the less savory bits, a fatter pig meant more profit at the market. In the countryside, whole families would be involved in the process of butchering the pigs, and the job was no easy feat. First, the pig had to be caught and then killed, a task which often required 2 men. Once the pig had been slain, its insides would be taken out and saved for sausage making. After being washed, the carcass would be salted and then left to hang. Children would be put to work cleaning the pig bristles and scraping off the remaining bits of skin. Once the meat was ready, people would gather together for an entire week to eat the pork before preserving it for the rest of the year. Any leftover scraps would then be saved for the next day's feast or turned into animal feed. Nothing went to waste. But if the cycle of feasting and fasting wasn't enough, Tudor pig farmers had to contend with another group of customers, swill laws. If you've ever wanted the recipe for disaster, try setting up a recycling program in the 16th century. But believe it or not, that's exactly what was happening. Across Tudor England, leftover food would be collected from monasteries, homes and markets, and given to poor farmers who needed to feed their animals. These leftovers were known as swill. But despite the noble intentions behind it, the system didn't always work out in favor of the hungry pigs. If the swill was of low quality, it could make the animals sick and sometimes even kill them. That's why careful watchmen were appointed to oversee the quality of the swill given to the pigs. Although the good intentions of the swill laws were there, they often created conflict between those providing the swill and those receiving it. As a result, squabbles over spoiled swill became commonplace in rural communities. To add insult to injury, if the recipients of the swill believed it was rotten or spoiled, they were expected to return it to the giver unopened. And if the watchman deemed that the swill was bad, they had the right to stop distribution altogether. As you might expect, one of the biggest consumers of pork in Tudor England was the royal family, whose love of pork led them to keep entire herds of swine. For example, Henry VIII had at least 3,000 pigs across his various properties. That's the equivalent of nearly 24 double-decker buses. As the Crown's agents were responsible for feeding these pigs, swill laws often provided an easy solution to feeding such a large herd. Unfortunately, this meant that London's supply of swill could often run dry by the time it got to the royal pigs. When that happened, the agents would travel to nearby towns to look for more food. They would scour market stalls and dining halls, searching for anything they could use to feed the starving swine. But if all else failed, they'd even resort to stealing swill from unsuspecting citizens. Despite the troubles of Tudor recycling, it wasn't all bad news for pigs. In fact, there were plenty of things that people loved about raising pigs. And in some cases, those feelings may have bordered on the obsessive. Much like dog lovers today, many Tudor farmers would talk to their animals and even develop affection for them. But while some farmers simply enjoyed the company of their animals, others went the extra mile to ensure their pigs' safety. Pigs were very susceptible to a number of different illnesses, but the most common was hog sickness, which was almost certainly caused by stress or damp conditions. But since medical science was still a few centuries away from discovering that fact, farmers relied on other methods of treatment. And the best way to prevent illness, according to many, was to speak to the pigs using special phrases. Researchers aren't entirely sure why speaking these phrases worked, but they speculate that it gave the animals some comfort, and that the act of speaking them gave farmers a sense of control over the situation. Either way, it became a common practice among Tudor farmers. Some took it even further and wore charms to protect their pigs from witchcraft. Back then, witches were believed to be able to cause illness in humans and animals alike, and farmers were understandably nervous about their stock falling victim to witchcraft. To combat this, they would wear charms such as copper bracelets or rings. carry amulets, and even use finger puppets to drive out any evil spirits that may be lingering nearby. One example of this practice comes from a letter written in 1598. It tells the story of a farmer who was so concerned about the threat of witches that he carried a charm made in the likeness of a cat. He walked around the field carrying the puppet on his finger and reciting a prayer. He believed that this would protect his pigs from any evil spirits that may have been lurking about. While charms and good luck phrases might seem a bit silly to us today, they were a real source of comfort to Tudor farmers. At a time when their livelihoods depended on the success of their animals, they were willing to try anything to ensure the safety of their stock. As the night deepens and the pigs settle under straw, we'll drift toward the heart of Tudor superstition, where butchers' blades gleamed under candlelight, and pigs were as magical as they were edible. This is a butcher's table. This is where the pig is going to be butchered. There are 2 fires built here today because we are going to cook the pigs as head, and we are going to render the lard. We are going to use every part of this animal. Nothing is wasted. However, during Tudor times, people did not buy their meat at the market. The butchering was done at home, and this is what that looked like. The head, trotters, blood, and innards were all saved and used. The head would be boiled for a very long time until it was tender, and then it would be served up with a sauce made from its own brains. The trotters were either boiled or roasted, and they were sometimes candied, which meant that they were cooked in sugar and spices. The blood was saved and turned into blood pudding. Now, blood pudding might sound disgusting to us today, but it was considered a delicacy in Tudor times, and it was eaten by both the poor and the rich. The innards were also saved and used. The liver, heart, and kidneys were either boiled, fried, or grilled. Sometimes the liver was cooked with wine and spices and served with bread and butter. The kidneys were often grilled and served with bacon. The small intestines were cleaned, and then they could be grilled or fried. They were sometimes stuffed with spices, and then they were grilled whole. As you can imagine, having a pig to butcher was quite a big event. It wasn't something that happened every day. This meant that when a pig was butchered, there was enough meat to feed the entire family for weeks. The meat would be salted, and then it would be stored in a cool place, such as a cellar. This is where the meat would last for a long time, so you could take out a slice whenever you needed it. Let's move on now to Tudor recipes. During Tudor times, pork pies were a real delicacy, and they were popular throughout England. These were made by taking the intestines of the pig and then sewing them up tightly. Then they would be filled with pork and spices, and then they were baked. Another popular dish was blood pudding, and this was made by boiling the blood of the pig with oatmeal or barley. This was then mixed with chopped up parts of the pig, such as the liver and the heart, and then it was all put into a bag made of the pig's stomach. This was then boiled for several hours until it was set. Now, back in Tudor times, they didn't have fridges, so they had to find other ways of keeping their meat fresh. One way they did this was by curing their meat in lard. Lard was the rendered fat from the pig, and it could be used to preserve meat for long periods of time. To cure meat in lard, the meat would be cut up into small pieces, and then it would be mixed with salt and pepper. It was sometimes also mixed with other spices, such as cloves or cinnamon. The meat was then layered with the lard in a container. The meat and the lard would be left for several weeks, and after this time, the meat would be ready to eat. You can still buy lard in the shops today, and you can use it to cook your food. Smoked sausages were also really popular in Tudor times. And these were made by putting the sausage meat into a skin made from the pig's stomach. The sausages were then smoked over a fire until they were hard and dry. This meant that they could be kept for a long time, and they were a real treasure to eat during the winter months. Back in Tudor times, salt was a very precious commodity, and it was expensive to import. Because of this, the people of Tudor times had to find ways of preserving their food without it. They also had to make sure that their food was smoked properly so that it lasted through the winter. This meant that smoked pork became a real winter treasure. People would look forward to eating it during the cold months. Finally, let's look at gender roles. When a pig was being butchered, it was usually a job for the men. The men would do the actual killing as well as cutting up the meat. However, women did help out in the process. They would help to prepare the meat, such as removing the skin and trimming away the fat. They would also help to salt and smoke the meat. However, cooking was seen as a woman's job. So once the meat was prepared, it was up to the women to cook it. They would boil, fry, or grill the meat, and they would also make dishes such as pork pies and blood pudding. Now, it's important to remember that not all families had male and female roles. Some families had to do whatever they had to do to survive. For example, if the husband was out working the fields, then it was up to the wife to take care of the animals and slaughter them. If the wife died, then it was up to the children to take over her work. There were even some widows who ran entire farms by themselves. So as you can imagine, women were just as busy as men. All right, so what did we learn? We learned that every part of the pig was used. Nothing went to waste. The butchery of a pig was a big event. It wasn't something that happened every day. The meat was cured and preserved so that it could last for a long time. The men did most of the butchering, but the women helped out. Cooking was seen as a woman's job. With the meat hung and the brine barrels sealed, let us slip into the noisy chaos of Tudor markets, where pig parts became coin and farmers bargained their way through survival. You see, the demand for pork was high amongst the masses, but especially among the wealthier classes who preferred it to beef. This was partially due to religious reasons, since cows were associated with the goddess of fertility, and eating them was tantamount to cannibalism, and partially because pork was easier to come by. Unlike cattle, which grazed on land that couldn't be used for anything else, pigs were less picky eaters and could survive off the scraps. They also reproduced like, well, rabbits, giving birth to litters of up to a dozen piglets every 2 years. So if your goal was to make money, raising pigs was a pretty safe bet. Just don't expect to get rich. While wealthy landowners with lots of acreage to spare might turn a tiny profit from their herds, most pig farmers were just barely getting by. The average farm had about 2 acres set aside for the sole purpose of feeding their pigs. On this patch of land, they'd plant maize, barley, oats, and peas, as well as a variety of fruit trees. That way, their pigs would always have something fresh to eat, even during the winter months. Come harvest time, though, you'd better hope that your croplands were more fruitful than usual. If not, you might need to sell off some of your pigs early to stay afloat. And as soon as your pigs were big enough to be profitable, you'd take them to market to see how much money you could get for them. So what was the best place to sell your wares? The answer, it depends. For smaller farmers who didn't want to travel too far, or whose pigs weren't quite big enough to fetch a good price at a traveling fair, the local market was the next best option. Tudor markets and trade. The local market was where most people got their meat. Stalls selling everything from poultry to pork were found in towns and cities all over England, and some were open every day, while others only came to town once a week. You'd find the vendors either standing behind wooden counters or just laid out in the open air, what we today would call stews. If you wanted to buy a pig at one of these markets, you'd first have to make sure that it met certain standards. There were regulations in place to protect buyers from getting ripped off or, having their guts spilled into their lap. And to prove that their pork was okay to eat, each pig had to pass a cursory examination by an official meat searcher. Those with bad cases of mange or other contagious diseases were sent packing, literally, and their owners were fined for trying to sell them. But bribes were common, and sometimes went all the way to the top. It was unheard of for the mayor or other prominent figures to accept money in exchange for turning a blind eye to diseased livestock. So let's say you managed to find an apparently healthy pig at the market. How much would it cost you? Well, that depended on a few factors, most notably the weight of the animal. Pigs were bought and sold by the pound, a unit of measurement equal to 8 of the longest common barleycorns laid end to end. According to records from 1547, a pound of pork averaged about 6 shillings and 8 pence, which sounds like a lot until you realize that a typical farm laborer made about 15 shillings a year. Suffice it to say, pork was a luxury good, and only the wealthy could afford to eat it regularly. Traveling fairs. Not all pig farmers were content with making small sales at the local markets. They dreamed bigger, bolder, and louder, as in the noise of crowds clamoring over one another to get a closer look at rare goods, being hawked by merchants from across the kingdom. To reach these rarefied financial ranks, though, you had to be willing to travel, sometimes miles, with your animals to sell them at a traveling fair. These festivals were held once a year and attracted droves of people looking to buy or sell livestock, including sheep, oxen, and of course, pigs. In addition to the animals themselves, you'd also find merchants selling a variety of other things, from clothes to candles, as well as food and drink to sustain weary shoppers throughout the day. All told, it was a bit like a Renaissance fair crossed with Black Friday, except unlike those modern incarnations. Traveling fairs in Tudor England were loud, very loud. Oaths, curses, cries of joy and sorrow, bleating, clucking, and mooing. Shouts of vendors and angry bellows of men trying to wrangle oversized animals through narrow streets, all blended together into a cacophony that lasted for days. And it wasn't just the noise that made these festivals so overwhelming. There were also a lot of people in attendance. As many as 10,000 people might cram into a single village on the day of the fair, straining the resources of the local leadership and sometimes leading to civil unrest. Not that any of this would bother the pigs. In fact, they probably enjoyed it, especially when the traveling entertainers made an appearance, dancing pigs in tow. Of course, all of this commotion wasn't for nothing. Traveling fairs were important sources of income for pig farmers, offering greater exposure than the local markets ever could. It also gave them a chance to get rid of older animals and repopulate their herds with younger stock. But there were risks involved too. When so many people from different areas gathered together, it only took one sick animal to spread disease across the entire country. Disease and risk. Nobody enjoyed eating pork more than the English, but there was always a dark cloud hanging over the industry. A single case of swine fever could wipe out an entire herd and leave its owner destitute. The disease was particularly nasty, causing high fevers, bloody discharges from the eyes and nose, and convulsions before death. The worst part, there was no cure. By the 16th century, England had experienced 3 major outbreaks of swine fever, and each one was worse than the last. The first began in 1517 and lasted 3 years. The second started in 1527 and didn't end until 1530. The third and largest outbreak swept across the countryside between 1551 and 1554. By the end of the third outbreak, an estimated 75% of all pigs in England were dead. As you can imagine, outbreaks caused a spike in pork prices, which hurt poorer families who relied on the cheap meat to stay alive. But that wasn't the only way that swine fever affected daily life. The disease was so widespread that farmers grew up learning its telltale signs, and watching for it was part of their daily routine. Every morning, they'd wake up before sunrise and head out to their pig pens to examine their animals. If everything seemed fine, they'd tend to the animals and send them off to graze. But they never let them out of their sight. Throughout the day, they watched their pigs for any sign of illness. A slight cough, discharge from the eyes or nose, a limp or loss of appetite, all of these could be signs of swine fever. And if they spotted anything unusual, they'd immediately quarantine the animal and keep a close eye on it. If it died, they buried it in a ditch and prayed that the rest of their herd would stay healthy. As you can imagine, all this watching and waiting was incredibly stressful and often took a heavy toll on the farmer's mental health. In fact, there were so many cases of swine fever that one writer compared it to the Black Death. But unlike that plague, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. All a farmer could do was watch and wait. Now that you know what it was like to be a Tudor pig farmer, it's time to try your hand at it. Raise a virtual herd of pigs, fend off diseases, and try to make a profit. After all, knowledge is power, right? The market fades into dusk. But the pig farmer's story doesn't end there. In our final chapter, we reflect on legacy, what it meant to raise pigs through faith, famine, and fate in Tudor England. When Elizabeth succeeded to the throne in 1558, she inherited a well-developed system of agricultural practices. Although new inventions and ideas from the New World would soon begin trickling in, much of the traditional ways of working the land remained unchanged. The older methods, some dating back centuries, had been passed down from father to son, generation after generation. One such technique that survived from the 1500s is the Norfolk four-course rotation. This system divided farmland into 4 sections, with each containing a different crop. This ensured that part of the land was always used for fodder crops, meaning there would always be food for livestock. As the crops were rotated around the fields year by year, the soil would be continuously enriched without overworking the land. While some large landowners exploited the labor of servants and even prisoners, many farmers were independent yeomen who farmed their own land and employed no one. They would have been responsible for every aspect of the work, including plowing, sowing and harvesting the crops, as well as raising animals for meat. During the 16th century, commoners who rented small plots of land from nobles also raised pigs, often keeping them alongside cattle, sheep, and poultry. These people weren't called farmers, but rather husbandmen, and they supplied the butcher with meat for sale in the market. Some wealthy merchants even bought breeding pairs to raise on their own land. And while most people raised pigs for slaughter, others kept them for their dung, which was used for cleaning and as fertilizer. Market gardeners, for instance, specialized in producing vegetables and fruit for sale in the towns and cities and relied on pig dung to keep their soil healthy and productive. Although pigs could be raised almost anywhere, The open fields surrounding villages were the ideal place to keep them. Here they could forage, rooting around for fallen fruit, nuts, and berries. And when the harvest came, they could supplement their diet with the grain that littered the fields. In the winter months, however, the land became too hard for rooting, so pigs were brought back to farmyards where they were fed on swill. Farmers gave their pigs the leftover slop from their evening meal, bits of meat, bones, potatoes, and other scraps. By feeding their pigs the leftovers, farmers saved on grain costs and made better use of their resources. Sometimes these scraps included small fish, and it was rumored that Henry VIII enjoyed serving up smoked eel heads to his pigs. But being a pig farmer wasn't all fun and games. Pigs are intelligent creatures, but they can be stubborn and unpredictable. Even experienced pig men knew to approach them with caution. When they were driven along the roads, they would often stop to beg for food, and they could root up the valuable crops of neighboring farms. And pigs didn't just run away. A frightened or angry pig could turn vicious, attacking anyone who got too close. For this reason, farmers wore thick leather aprons and carried long poles with sharp metal hooks at the end to steer their pigs. If attacked, they could fend off the animal until help arrived. But if a wild boar charged, then even these safeguards might not protect a pig man. Not only were they troublesome to manage, pigs were expensive to raise. An outbreak of disease could decimate a farmer's stock, and there was little he could do to prevent it. And if something did go wrong, the farmer couldn't simply call the vet. Instead, they turned to traditional methods of healing. One popular treatment involved rubbing a sick pig with a mixture of wine and rue, an aromatic herb, before driving it around a tree 9 times in a clockwise direction. Once this was done, the pig was returned to its sty and given bread mixed with beer to drink. This might sound comical, but the survival of both pig and farmer depended on the health of his stock. Religion also played a role in how and when pigs could be sold. During the 1500s, Christians observed fast days when eating meat was forbidden. These were set at the beginning of Lent and continued on various holy days throughout the year. This meant that pig farmers couldn't sell their wares on certain days of the week, including Fridays. Not only were pigs difficult to keep and hard to sell, the government also intervened, dictating how much farmers could charge. In 1571, the English government passed a series of acts for the regulation of markets. This ensured that prices remained fair, especially for poorer people who needed affordable meat. Selling pork above the set price was punishable by a fine, and those who hoarded or wasted food could be sent to prison. Given the Tudors' concerns about the cost of living, it's likely that the price of pork continued to be regulated throughout Elizabeth's reign. This meant that farmers couldn't always make a profit from their pigs, but it did ensure that their customers had access to cheap meat. It's likely that few pig farmers thought of themselves as such. Instead, they would have seen themselves as mixed farmers, tending to livestock as well as growing crops. Although pig farming wasn't dangerous enough to be considered a hazardous occupation, it was hard, dirty work. There was little reward for the farmer or his family. Their hands and clothes would be perpetually stained with mud and slops. Their fingernails would be bitten and broken from rooting around in the muck. And nothing about the job offered much comfort. The farmer lived a hand-to-mouth existence, relying on the whims of the weather, disease outbreaks, and government regulations. Although some landowners who specialized in raising pigs may have become wealthy, this was the exception rather than the rule. Most pig men died poor, having spent their lives working the land. But despite the low social status and hard work involved in pig farming, a good pig man was remembered fondly in local lore. The pigs themselves were sometimes mentioned in wills, showing that even in death, the farmer's legacy lived on. Now it's time to bring our journey through muddy fields and ancient kitchens to a close. If you've made it this far, then thank you. Leave a comment, share where you're from, and let me know which fact surprised you the most. If you liked this video, then please remember to share and subscribe. We'll see you again next time.